Okay, so picture this, a gigantic empire. I mean, truly massive, covering a sixth of the entire planet. Now, imagine that same powerhouse of an empire is just teetering on the edge of a total collapse. That's not a movie plot. That was the reality for Russia as the 20th century kicked off. It was a place just full of these wild contradictions. Yeah, I mean, from the outside looking in, Russia looked like a great world power. But if you scratch just beneath the surface, you could see these huge cracks starting to form. And that's really the big puzzle we're going to try and unpack here. How could a nation so enormous, so powerful, also be so incredibly fragile? What went wrong? Well, it all starts with what historians sometimes call the Russian paradox. And it's exactly what it sounds like. A nation that was just pulled into completely different directions by these deep and ultimately very dangerous contradictions. The contrast with what was happening in the rest of Europe at the time is just, it's night and day. In the West, you had all these industrial advances, people were getting more educated, they were gaining political rights, they could move up in society. But the Russian Empire, it felt like it was stuck in a time warp. It was huge, for sure, but also super undeveloped and locked into this really rigid social hierarchy. And here's a perfect example of what I mean: serfdom. This was basically a medieval system where peasants were, for all intents and purposes, owned by their landlords. They were property. Now, most of Western Europe got rid of this system by 1848, but Russia, they didn't get around to abolishing it until 1861. And even then, the shadow of serfdom just hung over the countryside for decades. So, you gotta ask, why was Russia so far behind? Well, it was facing some absolutely massive, unique challenges. First off, its size. We're talking about an empire that was twice the size of all of Europe combined. Then there's the brutal climate and tough terrain, which made building anything a constant battle. And it wasn't a unified nation, not really. It was this sprawling collection of different ethnic groups where less than half the people were actually ethnically Russian. Managing all that was a nightmare. But make no mistake, Russia was trying to catch up. And it went about it with this frantic, almost desperate push into the industrial age. It was progress, all right, but wow, did it come at a steep, steep price. I mean, just look at this number, 8%. That was the annual industrial growth rate for big chunks of the 2 decades before World War I. To put that in perspective, that is an explosive rate of change. Russia was suddenly one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. And you could see this incredible growth on the ground. It was changing everything. The population of the cities quadrupled, 4 times bigger in just 50 years. You had millions upon millions of people flooding into the cities, looking for work and completely transforming places like St. Petersburg and Moscow forever. Okay, but here's the flip side of that industrial boom. For this new working class, life was just awful. We're talking brutally long hours for very little pay, incredibly unsafe factories and mines, and people were crammed into these disgusting, unsanitary barracks. And get this, even though trade unions were technically allowed after 1905, it was still illegal to actually go on strike. And if you need one single story to understand just how brutal this system could be, it's the Lena Goldfields Massacre. In 1912, some gold miners went on strike. They weren't just ignored or fired, no. Government troops opened fire on them. Over 200 people were killed. As you can imagine, this sent an absolute shockwave of rage across the entire country. Now, all this change wasn't just happening in the cities. Out in the vast Russian countryside, things were being shaken up too. Some big agricultural reforms meant that the amount of land actually owned by peasants jumped from just 20% to almost 50% in a single decade. That's a huge shift. But here's the catch, and it's a really important one. This reform was a total double-edged sword. Sure, some peasants did really well for themselves. They became what you might call prosperous farmers. But for every one of them, there was another who just couldn't make it work. They ended up selling their little plot of land and joining this growing army of the landless poor who then, where did they go? They drifted to the cities, making the problems there even worse. So you've got all this economic and social turmoil bubbling up, and it's all happening under a political system that just refused to bend, not even an inch. Which, of course, brings us to the man at the top, the Tsar, and his absolute, unyielding grip on power. The system in Russia was what you call an autocracy. And the idea is pretty simple. One person has all the power, and there are absolutely no limits to it.
The Tsar didn't see himself as just a president or a prime minister. Oh no. He truly believed he was chosen by God to rule, and that he was only answerable to God. Not to the people, not to a parliament, only God.
So how did he hold on to that power? Well, he had a few key tools in his toolbox. First, the army, the biggest in the world with 6 million men. Then there was a giant government bureaucracy. And then there was the Okhrana. This was his secret police, and they were feared by everyone. They could basically arrest or exile anyone they wanted. As you can guess, free speech wasn't a thing, and any kind of political meeting was strictly forbidden. But then, in 1905, the whole system started to crack. It started with a really humiliating defeat in a war against Japan. That just lit a fuse. Unrest exploded everywhere. It all came to a head on Bloody Sunday, when troops fired on peaceful protesters. That was the spark. A full-blown revolution kicked off, with massive strikes that paralyzed the entire country. The Tsar was backed into a corner, and he was forced to make a promise: an elected assembly, called the Duma. So great, a step towards democracy, right? Problem solved? Well, not so fast. Before that first Duma could even have its first meeting, the Tsar put out these new fundamental laws. And what did they say? They basically said, just kidding, I'm still an autocrat, and by the way, this Duma has no real power over anything important. It was like giving a gift and then snatching it right back. So that empty promise, on top of all the social and economic problems we've been talking about, it created a perfect storm. And right into the middle of this incredibly volatile situation, a whole bunch of new political groups started to pop up, and each one had a very different idea of what Russia's future should look like. So let's break down who these new players were. First, you had the liberals. They were also called the cadets. These were mostly professional, middle-class folks, and they wanted Russia to be more like Britain, with a king or a czar, but also a real parliament. Then you had the social revolutionaries, or SRs. Their focus was on the peasants, and their big thing was land reform. And finally, you had the social democrats. These guys were Marxists, and their base was the new industrial working class in the cities. Okay, but here's where it gets really interesting, and this is a super important detail. Those social democrats, they couldn't agree on how to actually start their revolution. So the party split right in two. On one side, you had the Mensheviks. They wanted a big party with lots of members working openly through things like trade unions. But on the other side, you had Vladimir Lenin and his faction, the Bolsheviks. Lenin had a totally different idea. He wanted a small, secret, super disciplined party of professional revolutionaries who would lead the workers and seize power. And that split, right there, would literally change the course of world history. So when you boil it all down, this is the heart of the problem, right? The central conflict of the whole era. You have a country that's rocketing into the modern world with new factories and cities, but its political system is completely stuck in the past. It was this constant grinding struggle between the forces of modernization and a czar who was desperate to hold on to his absolute power no matter what. And that leaves us with one big final question, doesn't it? You've got this explosive recipe, rapid progress with no rights to go with it, massive disorienting change with no one in control. Was there any way for the Russian Empire to navigate this? Was there any path forward that didn't end in the total chaos of revolution? Or, by this point, was the storm just inevitable?